Welcome back, everybody. It is 8:51. We're going to stay on schedule today. We have such a great docket in front of us today, and what a joy it is to introduce Mr. Joe Karlin, who has joined us, and I see his face. Joe is going to walk through the devastation of losing a child, especially to suicide. He's going to discuss the impact the loss had on him and his family and the actions that they took to keep as many other families from experiencing the same loss and devastation. He'll discuss actions we can all take to help address the issue, as well as actions as a community we can take and consider to help address the problem. So Joe Karlin and his family reside in Lenexa. He and his wife, Amy, are parents to 4 children. He's a bank consultant and owns several small businesses. He serves on the Lenexa City Council. He is a board member on the CHASE Initiative for Autism Awareness and Education, and formerly served on the United Community Services of Johnson County's Drug and Alcohol Council. Joe's oldest son, Tom, took his own life on November 5th of 2011. The action took his friends and family completely by surprise and compelled them all to action to address teen depression and suicide prevention. To that end, the Karlins established the Tom Karlin Foundation. The mission of the Tom Karlin Foundation is to improve the quality of teens' lives and reduce teen suicides through education and awareness regarding depression, mental health, and suicide prevention. In the past few years, Joe has moved from local involvement to a more national focus on teen suicide prevention, specifically helping found the Linked by Legacy group comprised of similar organizations fighting to end suicide. And so without further ado, it is my pleasure to introduce Mr. Joe Karlin. And I see Joe has unmuted. Joe, thank you so much.
Thank you. I really appreciate the opportunity to be with you today. It is such an important topic, near and dear to my heart. And I appreciate all the time that you all are putting into this to make sure that we are supporting our community in every way possible. I'm going to hopefully share my screen. If I can you all see that screen?
Joe, it looks good.
Okay, thank you so much. So again, thank you for the introduction. I really look forward to visiting with you today. So in the past 10 years, I've had 3 phrases spoken to me that each one really impacted that day and the future in my life and my family's life. The first one, not the first one, but one instance was when I was told that I was having a heart attack, and not only a heart attack, but it was in the artery called the Widowmaker. The second one was when I was told that I had stage 4 cancer. The third one was when I was told my oldest son was dead. And I will tell you, I would rather hear the first 2 thousands of times versus hearing that my child was dead just once. It is that devastating, and it, as it was said in the introduction, it completely moved our family to make sure we could do as much as possible to make sure that as few families as possible experience the same loss that we did. So backing up a little bit over almost a decade ago, November 5th, 2011, really started fairly normal for me, and actually is a very good day. We were on vacation with several other couples, and as far as I knew, all that day was going to contain was some golf, some time by the pool, some drinks, and some good food. I had no idea when I woke up on November 5th, 2011, that before I even had breakfast, I would be calling my mom and telling her that her grandson was dead. I had no idea that I called my brother and my sisters and tell them that their nephew had killed himself. And there was such disbelief because this was a Tom we all knew and loved and was engaging, and from the outside look had everything going for him. but he had taken his own life in such a devastating impact to us and to our family. And this is a picture of Tom. This is about 2 months before he died, and this is our family. And I will tell you, we were the family next door. We were involved in our kids' life. We went to church, all those things that you would think a supportive family would do to create positive environments for their kids. So losing Tom absolutely took us by surprise. We struggled for a long time to figure out how to move forward as a family, individually, grieving through that whole process. But one thing we knew, and this was within days, maybe even hours after losing Tom, we knew we needed to do something to make sure as few families as possible experienced the same devastating impact. And so we developed the Tom Karlin Foundation. And we really had 3 goals. We were very teen focused because obviously Tom was a teen when he took his life, and we knew that was becoming more and more of an issue that was facing society. So our goal was to improve the quality of teens' lives, to educate on depression and suicide prevention, and then really more broadly even address mental wellness. If you think about 10 years ago, mental wellness, suicide, depression really was not talked about. And we have come as a society so far in 10 years that we are talking about it much more openly. And for example, just recently, there have been instances where several athletes have, such as Simone Biles, dropped out of the Olympics because of some mental health challenges. A tennis player did the same. 10 years ago, that would have been unheard of. And 10 years ago, that was just not talked about. So society has moved a long way, but we still have a long way to go to make sure we're addressing mental wellness. As was mentioned in the introduction, we're moving from not only local involvement, but to a group called Linked by Legacy. And that is a group comprised of foundations similar to ours who have been born by a family or a community losing a loved one. And what our goal is to work together as much as possible so that we can share ideas, share different products or services that we develop, and spread those across the nation. We also believe that depression is treatable. We believe that suicide is never a choice, but instead is often an escape from some overwhelming pain. And we also believe that every suicide is preventable. If we didn't believe that, we wouldn't be doing what we do in spending our time and effort to make sure that the community is educated. And I think the same thing would be said by many of the other presenters that you'll hear today. We all believe that we can make a difference. And we'll talk through in this presentation some of the things that we can do. We think it takes talking about it. And again, in the 10 years, this has changed a lot. So we're doing, as a community, a much better job of talking. It takes vulnerability. And I believe that means us as adults in particular, sharing our struggles. Because I think it's easy for especially our youth to look at us and think we have it all under control, that we don't face the challenges and pressures that they do. So it's being vulnerable and telling about the different times now or in our past that we struggled with different things. And lastly, it takes a village. This is not an educator issue. This is not a first responder issue. This is not a parent issue. This is a community issue to make sure we're addressing this problem. So before we start, we're going to take a little quiz. And I'd invite you to write down these answers if you'd like, or just keep them in your head. So the first question is, by the time a person turns 24, what is the likelihood that they will have experienced clinical depression? So that's the first question. Second question is, what's the average time that a person spends in depression? So from the time they first become depressed to the time they seek help. So is that months, years? If so, how many? We're going to talk about depression and sadness, and are the same or are they different? Next question is, does a suicidal person typically show signs Do they tell someone? And then lastly, is suicide really preventable? Okay, so for a little primer or back to the origins. So what really determines our mental health? And this is something I grabbed off the internet from Mental Health First Aid, which is a very helpful website. And there's really three factors that impact that. So the first is what we're born with. The second is what happens to us as we live our life. And then thirdly, what we do or how we think about things. So going back to the first, things we're born with. This is going to be our genetic makeup. Some people are just predisposed to depression, similar to how some people have bigger muscles than other people. It's just the way we were made. Secondly, what things happen to us in our lives. And that can be everything from being bullied to being neglected, abused, different things that shape our life that happen to us and really impact how we see things going forward. And then lastly, what we do or how we think about things. And that's really kind of the opposite end of the spectrum. That is what we learn, the coping mechanisms we learn, good or bad, to deal with the things as to how we're born or what happens to us. So that's really the origin and what determines our mental health. So one of the first questions to our quiz is suffering and depression. And this is from a TED Talk by Kevin Brill. I would strongly encourage it. He's at the time he records it, he's a 21-year-old comedian of all things that talks about his struggle with depression. And a quote from him I thought was really insightful. He said, "When things go bad, we're sad. But when things get better and times go by and we're still sad, that's depression." And I really think that spoke to the difference between short-term things that happen to us that are things in life that just happen and we're sad. But when those things start to get in the rearview mirror and we continue being sad, then that is when depression becomes a challenge. One of the things we talked about earlier in the three-part slide as to what causes depression was what happens to us in life. And one of the things that I want to mention is ACEs or ACTs, and you may very well be familiar with this. This ACEs stands for Acute Childhood Events, and the ACT stands for Acute Childhood Traumas. So these are things ranging from neglect to abuse to witnessing a violent event and those kind of things. And it really can have an impact on children and what they grow up into as an adult. This is from the CDC, and there's, I think, 9 or 10 ACEs or ACTs that can be experienced. And so typically what a person does if they're taking an ACEs test is they identify which of those 10 has, if any, has happened to them. And 1 in 6 adults experienced 4 or more types of ACEs. So the more ACEs you have, the more likely you are to potentially experience the downsides or the negatives from those ACEs. At least 5 of the top 10 leading causes of death are associated with ACEs. And we'll look at that in the next slide, but it is not just a mental health issue, but these ACEs impact our mental health, which then in response impact our physical health and our physical well-being. And then lastly, if we could prevent 44% of ACEs, if we could prevent ACEs, we could reduce depression in adults by as much as 44%. So these ACEs and ACTs have a big impact on teens and adults. And I will tell you, it is one experience that Tom had that we didn't know about until after he had died. So again, as I mentioned before, we felt like we were just family next door. My wife and I were thinking we were doing everything we could to help protect and build up each of our kids to be to be strong and independent. What we didn't realize is that he had experienced an ACE. He shared in his suicide note that he had been molested. And so this was news that we did not know. And it impacted how he felt about himself. Now, that is not the only reason I don't believe that he did it, but it really cast a shadow, and I can see now in retrospect, it really cast a shadow on how he felt about himself and the impact to his self-worth in everything stemming from that ACE. Here's some of the things that potentially impact us. As I talked before, ACEs can impact health conditions. And so the blue area talks about all the different impacts from ACEs, everything from depression, which you might expect, to strokes and diabetes. Risky behaviors often increase with ACEs, such as drinking and smoking. And then there can also be socioeconomic impacts, as you see in the green part down there. So these ACEs are so important. Many of you may have heard of being trauma informed, and that is something that we really promote, is for all of us to be informed that in certain circumstances, people experiencing depression or other challenges may have had childhood events that really impacted their well-being. This is from a book called Option B by Sheryl Sandberg. She was previously, or maybe still is, with Facebook. She talked about the 3 Ps that create a problem. First is personalization, when we think everything is our fault. Second is pervasiveness, where an instance where an issue in one area of our life pervades all areas of our life. And then lastly is permanence, the idea that this is never going to get better. This is always going to be with me. And as I think about Tom's situation, I can see that he had all 3 of these impacting his thoughts and his view of the future. He likely believed that it was his fault that he felt the way he did. And it's easy to allow something in one part of our life to pervade everything and feel like this is never going to get better, that it's always going to be with us. And those kind of things lead to a loss of hope. So the second part where we're going to answer one of our questions is the 20% represents how many young adults by the time they reach 24 will at some point experience clinical depression. And that is 20%. That's 1 in 5. And as we go talk to teens, we share that with them. And it certainly is not with the intent of scaring them. No, not at all. What we hope to identify is 1 in 5 people by the time they're 24 are going to experience depression. So if they feel like they are on an island, they can realize that 20% of the population is in the exact same boat that they are. So oftentimes what we'll do is, as we're talking to a group, we'll say, count 2 people to your left, 2 people to your right. Statistically, one of you by the time you're 24 is going to be depressed. And that really seems to sink in to let them know that if they're experiencing, or they have a friend who's experienced depression, that they don't need to feel like they're the only ones in that spot. The decade of darkness is, as you may have guessed, how long it takes a person from the time that they first become depressed to the time they get help. And when I heard this stat, I was blown away, because I never imagined it would be years, much less a decade, before people got help on average. And so I think of that as kind of this spectrum. And we're all on a spectrum somewhere between being happy to being depressed. And I believe the closer we get to that depression line, and the more time we spend towards that end of the spectrum, the risk of loss by suicide gets greater. So if we can identify when people are having troubles earlier, get them to treatment earlier, we have a lot better chance of moving them away from that troublesome end of the spectrum towards help sooner. Another graphic I saw on the internet that I thought spoke so strongly. Suicide is really a matter of when the pain that a person is experiencing is greater than their coping mechanisms. Plain and simple, that's it. And so if we can empower kids, if we can empower adults to either develop the coping mechanisms to deal with the pain, or if we can point them to therapists or neighbors, friends who can help them if they're getting to a point where they're feeling a lot of pain, we can reduce the number of suicides we experience. So before we get into suicide, let's talk a little bit about depression. So what are some of the warning signs of depression? One of the big ones that we see is drug and alcohol use. And we also often call this self-medication. So we tell teens, if you have a friend who's getting wasted every weekend, that is a problem. They likely are self-medicating some challenges they have in their psyche, be it problems at home, maybe ACEs, whatever. But if someone's getting blasted every weekend, that's a sign of a problem. Withdrawal from friends and family. And this is something in Tom's instance that, looking back now, I and we, our family, see, but at the time it wasn't incredibly obvious. But in the last month or two of his life, as I look back now, I see that he was stepping away from us and stepping away from his friends. We tried to have dinner together as a family, and as soon as we were done eating, Tom was up from the table and back to his room. Tom always went to the Friday night high school football game, except maybe the last 2 or 3 weeks. Didn't think much of it, but as we look back, he was stepping away from his friends and his family. Addictions somewhat relates to drug and alcohol, but it need not only be that. In fact, addiction to video games can be a challenge. If someone is constantly seeking to escape their current world, then that could be an indication that they are depressed. And again, something like a video game can be that escape for them. Comments of hopelessness or helplessness or wanting things to end, wanting not to be around, those are all signs, or could be signs, that someone's depressed. A difficulty or excessive sleeping is also a sign. And then school absences, or you could even add to that challenges with grades at schools. I had a principal at one of the high schools we spoke with. She said, if there were one indication that I would pick as the best one that a kid is struggling, it's when they stop showing up to school. She said that is by far the best indicator to her that there's a problem with that child. If they stop coming to school without a physical or a broken leg or whatever, that would be a good explanation as to why they're missing. She said that's a very good indicator that something's going on. The second best indicator is a drop in grades. And I think the thing we all need to remember is anyone can be depressed even if they look happy. Earlier, we talked about a comedian who talked about his struggle with depression. I imagine he was smiling and cracking jokes all the time, but he was depressed. You saw the picture of Tom. He looked pretty darn happy. In fact, when the evening before Tom died, my wife and I were out of town. He was having dinner with his grandma who was staying with our kids. And Tom was talking about what his future held and talked about it very excitedly, that he had, was looking forward to college, looking forward to all those things that the future held. And within hours, he was dead. So we don't necessarily have to think that that depression necessarily carries a certain look to it, because it does not. So something that is very closely related to depression is anxiety. And when we first started our talk, so this is almost a decade ago, when we started talking to teens and teen advocates such as counselors, teachers, parents, etc., we didn't really talk about anxiety because our teens didn't identify that as something they struggled with. But in the past decade, anxiety has increased tremendously. And I think it's in large part because of these phones we carry around and social media. And we have teens involved with the foundation through a teen advisory board. And one thing that I hear from them repeatedly is how much of a struggle their social media is. Even though they could escape it, it keeps drawing them back in because that's their connection to the world and many of their friends oftentimes. But always struggling to keep up with what's going on is a challenge. Seeing what parties you're not invited to. When most of us were in school, if we didn't get invited to a party, we might be upset about it when we first find out about it and think about it off and on. With social media, we can see pictures posted of people who are at the party we weren't invited to. And in fact, some of my teens said friends will often post pictures and specifically target people who were not invited just to make them feel bad, which really made me sad. But these phones are creating a lot of anxiety for our kids. And I think too, also some things that can create anxiety would be self-imposed or parental imposed expectations that don't line up with what a person wants to do or what a person feels they are capable of doing. So anxiety is a big thing that impacts our teens as well. And part of the connection between anxiety and depression is that if we're anxious, we're constantly in a state of disconnectedness. And if we are constantly anxious, we pretty soon, going back to those 3 Ps, we start thinking that it's pervasive and that it's permanent. So we become hopeless, which then leads to depression. Some of the warning signs of anxiety are pretty consistent with those from depression. A couple of new ones that weren't on the other list is consistent or excessive worry, which kind of makes sense. If we're anxious, we're probably worrying a lot about things that are going on in our life or that we see in the future. Physical problems with no physical cause. So this could be as simple as every morning when our kid wakes up, they have a stomach ache. And after they get past a certain class, they don't anymore. And that was actually something we saw in one of our children, not Tom, but they, for some reason, had an anxiety about a certain class. And that manifested itself in a stomach ache every morning. That went away after that class was over. And then lastly, the irritability, the mood swings, those can be signs of anxiety as well. So we've talked about depression, we've talked about anxiety. Now we're going to talk a little bit about suicide. And suicide is the second leading cause of death for those in the high school and young adults. 1 in 11 high school students attempted suicide. I found that stat absolutely staggering. I expected it to be maybe 1 in 100, but 1 in 11 attempted. And 1 in 8 have a plan. And we're going to talk a little bit later about the impact that moving from being depressed to having a plan and having the means to execute that plan, how it becomes incredibly, exponentially more risky that we're going to lose that person to suicide as they move down that spectrum. So let's talk a little bit about getting from a point where we're okay to a point where we're thinking about suicide as a solution. So the first thing that happens is a person can feel that they are a burden. And we see and hear this a lot in people sharing with us or in suicide notes of people who attempted or completed suicide, that they feel the world would be so much better without them. So perceived burdensome often comes first. And if they have a low belonging or social alienation, they don't really feel connected to a group. And so they feel like they're out there alone, they're on an island. And so those two things brought together can create the desire for suicide. So that's where they have this plan. They have this idea that suicide may be a way to escape the pain. Now, if we add in the acquired capabilities, so if that individual has access to a gun, if that person has access to medicine or meds that can cause an overdose, then that, along with the desire for suicide, is where a suicide attempt can come from. So they go all the way from feeling they're burdensome, not having a connection to anybody, and then having the means to complete their plan. That is when a suicide attempt can occur. But again, we believe that depression is treatable. Suicide is almost never a choice, but is seen as an option to end the pain. And again, we think that every suicide is preventable. So does a person tell others, or do they show signs when they are depressed and considering suicide? So research, and this is from, you can see the website there at the bottom, research that they performed indicates that up to 80% of suicidal people signal their intentions to others. And so the answer is yes, they do tell others, they do give signs. They may be subtle signs, but they do give signs that I'm struggling and I'm thinking of taking my own life. Often I get asked the question, okay, so if I don't know if someone is suicidal, I really am hesitant to mention suicide because I don't want to put that in their head. And another note from this research is that there's no research evidence that indicates talking about suicide leads to suicide. And what we often hear from people experiencing struggles and depression and considering suicide, what they will say after the fact is, when people reached out to me and acknowledged my pain and asked if I was suicidal, that was actually a relief to me instead of a burden, because I felt that somebody understood. So we encourage our teens and teen advocates, if they're concerned about somebody, to be very direct and to mention, are you going to hurt yourself? Do you feel like killing yourself? As opposed to being vague, such as, are you okay? Because the answer to are you okay most likely is going to be, yeah, I'm fine. But the more specific we get, the more pointed that becomes for the person to answer, and the more relief they feel that someone gets it, someone understands I'm in trouble, someone's here to help. So be very direct if and when you face people who you believe may be suicidal. So our tagline at the Tom Karlin Foundation is talk, listen, act. And what we believe that means is, first of all, talking. And what you all are doing with this symposium is one way to start that conversation. And we encourage our teens and teen advocates to have that conversations with others, really bringing up the topic of depression, struggles, and the victories we have over those challenges. Just talk, talk, talk. Make sure that we're talking about mental wellness and bringing that to the forefront every time we have an opportunity to do so. Listen is really about listening and watching. And so this is a time when we can not only listen to respond, but really listen to understand where someone is coming from. We tell our parents, and this isn't meant to scare them, but as a parent, it scares me. But if a teen is going to tell someone they're struggling, the order they do that is they'll tell a same gender peer, they'll tell an opposite gender peer, they'll tell a trusted adult, coach, counselor, pastor, etc. The last person they're going to tell is their parents. And so earlier we talked about it taking a village. We believe it takes a village to watch out, to listen and watch our peers, because I may not see my kids exhibiting a challenge, but I may see, or friends of my kids may see them because they interact more often with my kid, or because they are a trusted adult. So we really encourage everybody to listen and watch not only their own kids, but the entire community of children. And then lastly is ACT. And when we made up our tagline, we didn't know that ACT was actually an acrostic for suicide prevention. And what it stands for is acknowledge, caring, concern, and treatment. And this is something we train our teens and teen advocates to memorize and role play. Because if we fear someone is suicidal, that's a big jump to go up and ask that person how they're doing and try to intervene. So we actually role play between teens and between parents and kids to do the ACT, to acknowledge and care and concern, and then treatment. And so what that looks like, especially I'm going to think of a high school situation where maybe we see, I as a peer see another peer doing something that causes me concern. What we encourage that kid to do is say to their friend, hey, I noticed that you haven't been coming to the football games. I noticed that you're putting some stuff out on social media that really makes me think you may be in some pain. Care and concern. I care a lot about you. I am very concerned as to how you're doing. Treatment. Let's go visit our counselor. Let's go visit Mrs. Smith and talk to her. And we encourage that teen or that parent to take the individual, to actually take them to the counselor or pastor or trusted adult, whoever that is. Because it's too easy for the person we're intervening with to say, yeah, I'll check in with my parents, or I'll check in with a counselor. They're unlikely to do that. So physically take them to that trusted adult to get them help. And I know of at least 4 instances where members of our teen advisory board have done exactly that for a friend. And one of the teens talked about how she really struggled with the decision whether to do that or not because she feared losing a friend. And she tells a story about how when she did report her friend, so she couldn't get her friend to go with her, so she went to the counselor and reported to the counselor on this individual. And she said, I lost a friendship for about half a year because that student was so mad at her for reporting her. But she says, in the later months when she was recovering, when she was in a better place, she approached our teen advisory board member and said, thank you so much for doing that, because that is what I needed, but I didn't know it at the time. And so that Julia is her name, the girl who helped her friend, said, when I think about this, I'd much rather lose a friend because I lose a friendship than lose a friend because they take their own life. So getting and taking them to the trusted adult, interacting, intervening is really important. So what exactly are the things that we can do to intervene for a person at risk? And this is really that third bubble that we talked about as far as means and different things that can happen. I'm sorry, I was off a slide. So how long do we have to intervene for a person at risk? So is that something we would look at a calendar for, or something we would look at a stopwatch for? Are we talking weeks and days, or are we talking minutes? So how long do we have to intervene for a person at risk? This was pretty scary when I first learned this. Most people, so this is taken from people who attempted but did not complete suicide for a variety of reasons. And more than 70% of those decided within an hour before they committed the act that they were going to do that. 25% decided 5 minutes before they did the act of taking their life, or attempting to take their life. So the answer there is it's a stopwatch. When someone gets to the end of the spectrum where they're struggling, it does not take much for them to move from there to attempting. So we really need to be vigilant and make sure we do everything we can to move people further away from that danger area where they would think about taking their life. Interesting, 55% of teens who committed suicide had never sought mental health assistance. So thinking that we can, kind of like we talked about before, thinking that we can see people who are struggling or that they will raise their own hand, that doesn't always happen. In fact, in the majority of cases, teens don't do that before they attempt suicide. So, is suicide really preventable? So this obviously is a picture of the Golden Gate Bridge. If a person goes to the Golden Gate Bridge with the intention of committing suicide, they intend to die. The likelihood that you survive a jump off Golden Gate Bridge is in the low single digits, like 1 or 2% that you're going to survive. So people who go to the Golden Gate Bridge are not, seeking attention. They actually intend to die. So there was a study done of individuals who had gone to the Golden Gate Bridge with the intention of jumping off. Someone intervened to stop them from doing that. And this study was, of those individuals that were stopped, how many were still alive a decade later? And how many had not died by suicide, but either were still alive or died from natural causes, car accident, etc. And when I heard that, I expected that the number would be, I don't know, maybe 40 or 50%. Because I thought, if someone is that desperate and so seeking suicide, what's the likelihood that they're going to be around a decade later? Surprisingly, 90% of those people were still around a decade later. So that really spoke to me that we can intervene. We can stop suicides. People who were so intent on dying, 90% of them a decade later were still around. So what you are doing can make a difference in preventing suicides, and I strongly encourage you to keep that up. One of the last things I'll talk about is early intervention. We are a firm believer that the earlier we can get to somebody, the better off we are. Some of the ideas that our teen advisory board had is what they called life coaches. So a little bit different than a counselor or a therapist, but this is somebody who they can go to get help if they need help. And that could be, and oftentimes is not necessarily someone who just has the title of counselor at, for example, a high school. But instead, oftentimes it's that coach, it's that teacher that really works to develop a relationship with the kid, that they can go to them to get the help that they need. And in fact, the high school that my kids go to, she retired, unfortunately, because she was such an amazing teacher. But Miss Gill was one of those teachers who was a counselor without the title. So many kids went to her when they were struggling or needed some help. So that's a great example of someone who can help without necessarily having that title. If someone is seeking help and they're actively seeking out a counselor or a therapist and they're trying to get help, we really encourage them to continue going until they find a counselor or a therapist that they are comfortable with. Not every counselor-client relationship is going to be the fit. And so we really encourage kids to continue going until they find that person that they really connect with and can really start sharing with. Because until you develop that bond and that relationship, true sharing and true recovery is likely not to happen. And then lastly, we really encourage everyone to be trauma informed, talking again about those ACEs and those ACTs that can have an impact on us throughout our livelihood. So what else can we do? And this is focused on means restriction. So if we can remove from the environment those things that can cause harm. So there you'll see a medicine take back and a box of different kind of pills. You know, if we in our home have a Costco size bottle of medicine, that can be lethal. That could be the means that someone needs to take their own life. So we really encourage parents to lock up all medicines, and don't assume that your kids don't know where the medicine is. If you put it away somewhere, truly lock it up. We have a picture of a gun there. The 8 times and 35 times. So research was completed that a male with a gun in his possession or household is 8 times more likely to die by suicide. A female with a gun in their possession or within their household is 35 times more likely to die by suicide. So we really encourage parents to lock their guns up. Don't let your kids know where the keys are. Don't assume just because you think you're hiding it well that your kid doesn't know where it is, because very likely they do know where the gun is. So many police stations give away gun locks free. I believe Children's Mercy Hospital does as well. So really find those ways to lock up the means to remove those opportunities for anybody to take their own life. All right, so that's the end of the presentation. We're going to go back to the quiz and see how you all did. So what percentage of teens will experience clinical depression by the time they're 24? That's 1 in 5, 20%. Again, this is a pervasive problem, and we say that not to scare the teen, but to make sure they understand that they are not alone, or their friend is not alone, that a lot of people experience this and something can be done about it. Average time a person spends depressed before getting help, if you'll remember, this was the decade of darkness. 10 years from the time a person gets depressed on average till the time they get help. We talked about depression and sadness, whereas sadness is something that happens, we're sad about it. But depression is as we move away from that event and we're still depressed, still sad, then that is a definition of depression. Does a suicidal person show signs or tell somebody? We talked about how 80% of individuals will tell somebody, will indicate to somebody that they are thinking of taking their life. So the answer is yes, typically a person does. And is suicide really preventable? And again, I go back to the Golden Gate Bridge example that we had, where 90% of people who had every intention of dying that day were still alive a decade later. Lastly, these are some of the resources that we've come across, either phone numbers or a text hotline, an app that you can download, or we encourage you to have friends download so they get the resources they need. So with that, I am going to go back and would be happy to answer any questions that anybody has.
Thank you so much, Joe. That was just laden with all sorts of great advice and facts and experience. And thank you so much for sharing your personal story with everyone. We really appreciate that. There have been lots of questions that have come through the chat, and I'm glad we've got 11 minutes that we can entertain those. So, Joe, the first one, does your organization provide peer training?
Thank you. Yes, we do. So, as I mentioned before, we're moving more towards a national focus, but we absolutely would be more than happy to present to anybody in the community. And so often what we will do is I'll give a very skinny presentation of what I spoke to today, and then we'll have our teens do the exact, they'll share their specific experiences. Because especially if we're talking to teens, we'd much rather have teens talking to teens as opposed to a guy with gray hair. So so that's what we'll have the teens do. And then, as I said before, we'll often go into role play where we have kids practice the ACT, the Acknowledge, Care, Concern, and Training. And so if you're interested, I can, after we're done, I'll type in my contact information. I'd be happy for anybody to contact me and for us to provide training.
Awesome. Somebody did just ask if we can show the phone numbers again, or if we can throw those in the chat. I think there were some 1-800 numbers and things that you had put up on one of those last slides. Those were very helpful.
Yes, when I'm done, I will put those up on. I'll put those in the chat as well as my contact information.
Okay. Someone had asked, you had included about halfway through some statistics. They were wondering about the source of your statistics?
I would have to go back. I got everything from the internet, so I know it has to be true. I don't recall right off. I use several different resources. But if you want to, I don't know, maybe in chat, identify which one specifically you're looking for, or if you'd like, I can share the PowerPoint with you, and then anybody can get it if they want to. Would that be?
That'd be great.
Okay.
Yeah, that would be great. You've a lot of homework to do today, Joe. Goodness.
Yeah, exactly.
Another question that came through was, what is one takeaway you want us to remember from your presentation today?
I think the one takeaway would be that we truly can make a difference. And you know what I'm often think of is, and all of you have probably heard this 100 times, but the starfish story, where this little girl was walking along the beach and there were all kinds of starfish on the beach. And she was picking up one at a time, throwing it back in the ocean. And her dad said, "Look how many starfish are up here. You can't possibly save them all. You're not making a difference." She picks one up, puts it in the ocean, and she said, "I'm making a difference for that one." And so I think we can approach suicide prevention and depression awareness the same way, that by talking about it, by listening and watching, we can make a difference in the world. And I know firsthand from the work that we and other similar foundations have done, that there have been lives saved because we're talking about it and watching.
Perfect. Thank you very much. What about thinking from the vantage point of being the father or the family member of someone who's taken their own life? You know, what are some things that folks can do to really support families who have lost someone to suicide?
Boy, that's I would say the biggest thing they can do is just be present, because there's nothing somebody can say that is going to make it better. And I know so many people approached us after Tom died with the best of intentions of saying things that they thought were helping and really were quite hurtful. Things such as, he's in a better place, God has a plan for everything. At the time, our world had just exploded. And so, but the things that I remember was, for example, my neighbor, I had run into a couple times at Starbucks in the year or so before. He brought me over to Starbucks. And that meant probably more to me than anything else I can recall. So being present and being supportive are the biggest things we can do for a family who has experienced suicide.
Yeah, thank you. And I would echo Joe. Joe, you had joined after I gave an introduction, and I lost a brother 7 years ago to suicide. And
sorry.
And my advice would be, don't not say anything. I think just being willing to tell folks that you're sorry and that you're thinking about them and that they mean a lot to you, and sending the random text or making the phone call or sending the card in the mail, those sorts of gestures that make you feel like people have their arms around you really go a long way.
Completely agree. Yes.
What can we do to, I loved the acronym that you used, the ACT acronym, but are there other things that we can do prior to that crisis point to encourage teens to talk, to get them to open up, to establish those relationships? Do you have any suggestions for that?
Oh boy, that's a tough one. I think if we can make a mental wellness a common conversation, I think we're so much better. I'm aware of a high school here in the area that they have what they call families. And so these families, excuse me, as a new student comes into the high school, they're assigned to a family. And this will be, for example, 10 freshmen, 10 sophomores, so on and so on. And this family, they interact every week. And I think that's an incredible opportunity for those family members to be aware of what's happening with other family members. And as we talked about, teens are so much more likely to talk to one of their peers, that can really be the early indication to identify if there's a problem, but even more broadly to talk about how they're doing and to talk about when they're probably more likely to raise their hand if they're struggling in that circumstance.
Awesome. What a great concept. I didn't realize anybody in the area was doing that. That's enlightening for sure. What about there's so much going on in the chat too, Joe. I don't know if you've got time to scroll through when you're done, but there's a lot of great dialogue taking place there. Somebody had asked, because it is getting more difficult to find a mental health professional, psychologist, psychiatrist. Does your foundation have any advice on the best way to tap into resources, professional resources?
That is probably the one thing that is most disappointing is not the right word, but I think that's one of the biggest challenges we have, because we do have a list of counselors, and unfortunately most of those counselors will say, I'm booked up. I can see new patients in 3 or 4 months. Well, someone doesn't have 3 or 4 months in some cases. So I think we need to do 2 things. One is, I think we as a community need to really invest in educating and bringing more counselors online. And I think the second thing we need to do is make more life coaches who can be those early detection people that we go to, or that bring someone in trouble to a counselor or therapist.
Outstanding. Yeah, I think I'm sure everyone would agree that not many great things have come from the pandemic, but one of the things that has been, I think, really valuable has been just this surge of telehealth opportunities, not only for medical appointments, but for mental health and counseling and that sort of thing. I think that's been pretty powerful.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah. Joe, a lot of great comments in the chat section. A lot of gratitude for sharing your story. A lot of gratitude for the resources that you have compiled, and just thank you so much for this huge body of work that you and your family and your foundation have put together over the last 10 years to help other people. I think it's just been tremendous work, and we really appreciate your time.
Thank you so much. I appreciate all that you do, and hope you have a great rest of the day.
We are planning on it. Thank you so much. Feel free to drop back in anytime if you've got the minutes.
Thank you, and I will drop that information in the chat box later on this morning.
Great. Wonderful. Thank you.
All.